Hello and welcome to episode 78 of the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Tom Gold. Tom, it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing today?
I'm very good, and Lewis, thank you very much for having me on the show. I know we've spoken before, but I've been really looking forward to appearing on the TRUUMAN Podcast. So thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Yes, we have spoken a few times before, so I will let the listeners know this will be a good episode. It will be an interesting episode. I think it's really something that is a bit different, but also a bit mainstream, which is a bit of a bizarre way of putting it. But Tom, as always, in your own words, what makes you a man?
Yeah, I've given that some thought. You told me you were going to ask this. For me, it's a pretty short list. I think it's really important to set a good example for young men and other men around me. I think, we do that through sort of honesty, integrity, and being there for our brother man. I think those are probably the three most sort of important elements of that. I place a pretty high importance on staying fit and strong. I do my flat out best with that. I'm 54 now. I'm looking forward to taking the tests to be a retained firefighter at my local station. It's a bit of a, looking forward to that. Yeah, a bit old for it, but yeah, I think putting that time in, working out regularly makes you ready for these things. And it's pretty important to me. And I think lastly on that question, Lewis, the idea of traditional male values of courage, strength, integrity, honesty, being there for someone else. I think it's really important to recognize these aren't exclusively male values, but I do think that men will look at them, describe them, and enact them in a different way. I think they have their own way of approaching these sort of core things. And lastly, I suppose the list of what it takes to be a man gets longer every month. There's more and more stuff being added to what we're supposed to be able to do. A very different picture from, over here's my grandfather's picture, very different from his day. It was a short list and it didn't get any longer.
Let's dig into that a little bit. What's your sort of thoughts on that? Because I feel that there's almost additional pressure on men and boys to be protector, provider, traditional, but then also all this other list. So it's like a man can be anything that he wants, but it's almost like you have to be everything. Like you have to be a good dad, you have to be this. Like, what's your thoughts on that sort of additional pressure that's being put on boys and men?
Yeah, it certainly shouldn't be feeling like pressure is my thoughts on that. I think be interested to know if your viewers agree with this, Lewis, but I think, there's a growing and sort of hard to ignore awareness that, men can improve their, let's say, emotional coherence. I prefer that term to vulnerability. It's just never flown very well with me, that one. But I think, emotional coherence is something we can improve on. There's some fantastic work being done in that space, by outfits like Andy's Man Club and a growing number of men's groups where guys are encouraged to talk and they're given to understand by other men that actually that's not going to be a bad thing for them. They don't have to sort of bare their soul. They don't have to shed a tear because, sometimes being in the company of other dudes and sharing these things, they can't fix it. They can't make it all okay for you, but they can give you to understand that they're there. They've been there, they understand it, or they've got your back. And I think that's absolutely priceless. I do see that as a relatively new thing and a very positive thing. In the wake of that very grisly drama adolescence, the debates kind of sparked up again about, should we show this in schools, and this idea of a sort of blaming culture of, boys being told, don't be toxic, don't be this, don't be that, that's all wrong. And yeah, it does worry me a little bit that's the message. Gosh, I don't want to start rambling, but feminism in its original format is about equality, not about victory or, pushing one agenda at the expense of another. And there's been I've heard quite a lot of talk recently, other guys blaming feminists for demasculizing men or promoting these, unmasculine ideas about vulnerability. I like the original format of feminism, equality. I don't think that's too much to ask, and I think we can probably manage it. So sorry, a little bit of a sort of rambling answer to your question there, Lewis. I hope I've covered at least some of it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, rambling is the joys of podcasting. We can ramble all day till we're blue in the face. I find it really interesting. Again, I sort of agree on this narrative of feminism and what it has set out to do, and maybe how boys are perceiving it. Not necessarily that it's not achieving those goals that it set out to do, but maybe just how it's being perceived in sort of life, really, like how they're looking at it. And we sort of have had these conversations before around like patriarchal systems, and do they really exist for a lot of boys, or are they just being told about a history lesson that isn't really benefiting them? So yeah, I get where you're coming from, and I don't want it to be a pressure for men as well, but I just feel that there is this now almost additional pressure of you still need to be everything you were, and you also need to be able to cry and have all these conversations, and it's just cherry picking the bits that suit you the most as a man, in my opinion, is sort of where we're at with it. But it'd be really good to get an understanding of what it is that you do in the men's space, so that we can sort of really dig into that side of things as well.
Right. Well, I suppose I would place myself on the sort of more traditional end of the scale when it comes to, the variety of, new influences and new expectations on men. I'm still kind of holding on to some of the core values that I was brought up on. I still see, tremendous value in them. My preferred way of working with other guys is always sitting around a campfire somewhere scenic, out in the trees in the forest, hang the kettle over it and just talk. You know what? Sometimes it's not really massively important to have an agenda. Being together in that space, the only sort of expectations or requests I'll put on people, usually at these sessions, is speak to at least 2 people you don't already know. And you don't have to say anything at all beyond that. If you just want to sit and listen and be part of this, then great. And I think if I've done my job right in that circumstance, then people will feel okay to speak up if they have something important to share. And the other understanding I have with the guys in that group is that everybody's contribution is to be treated with, consideration and respect. We might not all agree, but we can certainly listen to one another like gentlemen. So yeah, as a format, it's pretty simple. I was out yesterday with a group. They're all ex-military veterans. Many of them had some very traumatic experiences during their service lives. We cooked Spanish rice casserole on the fire, and we did some metal detecting. And I think the most important thing to come out of that is that they were in the company of other guys who just get it. They've been where they've been. It is an environment where they can sometimes, if they wish to, share some of the more sort of saltier opinions that probably just wouldn't fly very well on social media or in regular company. But again, they're safe to do that there. And I think that's really, really important. It's not just sort of Scotland's veterans community, but there's a lot of men who are just generally isolated. We don't congregate in the same way that we used to anymore. And online can't always fill that gap. Sometimes you just got to be in the same place as other dudes and listen to what they've got to say. And here's something I've thought for a very long time, is that it's a popular opinion to say that men's conversations are superficial: cars, sport, sex, whatever, this sort of short list. And I think a lot of guys have fed into that and actually made that into a reality. And I think women have jumped on that bandwagon and fed it back to us, and that somehow legitimized it as well. This view that a lot of men have, of being simple creatures whose needs are easily fulfilled and met. And I don't believe it for a minute. It is a cozy view, and it's certainly a very easy one to follow. I'm a guy of simple tastes, a pint, watch the game, etc., a bit of banter, and I'm fine. Well, there's so many men out there who really aren't fine, who do have all of those things. It makes me wonder if, why we still persist in this sort of creature of simple tastes view. I think it's become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't always think it's really, really helpful, but it sure is easy, and it's very cozy as well at the same time.
For sure. I think men are definitely more complex than we give them credit for, even if they do have benefit in all of those things. One thing that you did mention was having conversations that they feel safe to have in that environment, that might not be said in different company, or might not be said online. Why do you think it's important because you mentioned it was important, why do you think it's important for men to have those conversations in a safe space?
God, just to get it out there, I think, and when they do, I've seen this so many times. And we're not talking about ultra controversial stuff at the end of the day. I was with a group of guys last week, and we were discussing, it came up, job applications that people had made and been turned down for, and the possible reasons that had happened. And there was some succinctly and constructively expressed annoyance, anger even, at this. I think it's really important there. Other guys in that circle were able to acknowledge it for those people who had this problem, because that in itself can be done in a much subtler way. A guy can express his understanding and empathy with a nod or a clap on the arm, or these much more subtle things that sometimes go completely unnoticed. When you're sitting around a campfire or in a group setting, in a physical setting, you tend to notice these things. And I think it's absolutely vital, because we've all seen what happens to people who contain all of this ad infinitum, as following the traditional man code, nail the lid down tight shut on it, and compress it. It doesn't work, or at least it leads to some sort of longer term problems. I think it's absolutely key that they've got that space to do it. And whilst the list of what a guy is supposed to be able to do gets longer, the number of places in which they can actually express opinions that might be seen as controversial is dwindling, because you sure as heck don't want to do it on something like LinkedIn or X or anything like that, because that can be just game over. A sort of poorly thought out but well meant bit of expression of anger or disappointment can be catastrophic in ways that were just simply not the case. In my own recollection. Yeah, I'm not legitimizing men coming together and sharing, racist or homophobic or, anti-religious sentiments. I don't permit any of that in my groups. But at the same time, there's a lot of other things that I think, guys need to be able to get out there.
Yeah, it's not a case of extremes. It's more a case of sharing that annoyance. I guess some may say maybe what women do when they're having a chat, right? I'm sure they have some annoyances as well that they want to get off their chest. So it's important to share those with people that maybe understand them but not and agree with them, but it's not a hatred build, or it's a release, not a vendetta, I guess is the way you're sort of putting it, right?
Yeah, absolutely that, Lewis. There's got to be a kind of an outlet for this at some point, and if it's expressed in a sort of reasonably philosophical manner, I think it's really important that people get that opportunity. You place something online that is controversial and it's kind of stuck there. If you don't take it down or someone else reposts it, that's it. You can't possibly reclaim that. I've seen this I've run quite a number of groups for people who've got dealing with some mental health difficulties. And in a way, that's a kind of, it's not so very different, because, you know, as time goes on, we become less and less familiar with a actual social space of everybody in the same place. And, you know, if you're running that group right, then it, you know, and somebody says something that they wish they hadn't said, it's okay. It's recoverable. You know, we can deal with it. It doesn't have to end with a sort of cancellation or anything like that. You know, social skills are perishable, and it's easy sometimes, you know, if you're not familiar with being in a group setting. And I saw this when we started running our first sessions again after lockdown. Everyone was absolutely on eggshells, because it was the first time they'd been in physical company in nearly 2 years. So sooner or later, someone's going to say something that just doesn't sound, you know, sounds a little bit daft or whatever. But, you know, again, if you've created that environment, okay, it's 100% recoverable, and vital to have that opportunity as well.
A lot of your sessions, well, in fact, all of your sessions revolve around fire and the campfire. Why do you think that's so important?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the earliest known deliberate campfire site was found outside a cave in Africa. I wish I could remember the name of the place, but archaeologists realized that this was not an accidental thing. There was shellfish remains and various other things. It was clearly deliberate. That was just under 1 million years ago. So those weren't even humans. Those were our pre-human ancestors. From that day, or roughly that day, until this, or until very, very recently, humans have come together in this format to talk about, or to share ideas, to share plans, hopes, fears, to share technology. Hey, guess what I just made? Check this out. People see sort of fire. It's always man discovers fire. Who knows who it was in the as a trigger point for all our sort of most important technological developments. From there was cooking meat, there was pottery, then much further down there was processing metal. The first real development from the campfire was social, because for the first time our pre-human ancestors had a reason to come together when it was cold and it was dark. So I see that as a massively sort of significant trigger point for human beings. For the first time, they're in a group and they're sharing stuff, and it still works. I've seen it time without number. The first early humans who left Africa to cross over into Europe probably sat around a campfire the night before they left and examined the enormity of what they were about to do. Because I'm in Scotland, I'm thinking of William Wallace and his men the night before the Battle of Bannockburn probably sat round the fire. They might have sketched out a few ideas on the ground in front of them, but they used this format to come together and share some really, really important information. All the way through, this format has just worked for people. And it's always the same. When you bring people together like that, you never have to say, right, folks, let's form a circle round the fire. Never have to. Everyone just does that. And there'll always come a moment where everyone's just looking inwards and it's quiet. No one's saying anything. People might be just watching the embers change. They might be watching the sparks twist up into the, you know, into the darkness, whatever. And you look around and they're all actually in a good place. No one's saying anything, but, you know, everyone seems that there's that sort of contented feel to the group. I think we have a deep-rooted genetic memory for this particular format. Even non-outdoorsy people, and I've met hundreds of them, can be perfectly comfortable sitting around in that environment. I think they're going back to an earlier version of ourselves that just makes sense. So yeah, whilst it has some practical difficulties, it's not the same as arranging a group Zoom. Definitely, you're going to do a little bit more work. It works in a way people will be honest and talkative in a way that they just don't do in a room with white walls with all the chairs in a circle. Because I've tried both, and I've got my own opinions on which works best.
Well, it's really funny because we talk about circles and like sitting around in that, and like how men generally are more open shoulder to shoulder and this like doing of an activity. But if that circle has a fire in the middle of it, then it's a completely different scenario. Obviously, don't go and start fires in your local village hall, but there is an element of that the circle that we create. I remember my first men's group that I did it in a circle, and to me, I left it after, and I was like, it was almost like man anonymous, like, hi, I'm Lewis, I'm a man. Like, it was a bit very bizarre and very almost surreal. So to move that outdoors, one, and then to put that fire in that place, but yet those men still form that circle, even though it's really against their thought process if they were to go into a village hall, say an Andy's Man Club or another men's group that has the chairs in a circle. So it's interesting that even though those men may not go to circles, they still sit in circles whence there's a fire there, which, yeah, interesting.
Absolutely. I just think we have a deep-rooted genetic memory for this. This has been the only explanation I can come up with. And I should have said, actually, Lewis, a room of white walls and chairs in a circle, that is exactly how Andy's Man Club operates. And thank goodness they do. What a game-changing outfit they've been. Yeah, for purely practical purposes, that's how they work. I was given a Andy's Man Club wristband at an event I was at a couple of years ago by a guy who said, this saved my life. So it was kind of a big deal when he took it off his own wrist and gave it to me. I kept it until it snapped. A year or so later, I got it. This was a hugely significant thing. So yeah, if Andy's Man Club did fires, heck, what could we achieve?
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's sort of look at that, and let's look at this journey, right? So a lot of the guys that you're dealing with, you mentioned sort of expats and that side of things, manly men, let's say. Do you feel there's more of a journey to that? So like, one of those may never go to a man club in any way, shape, or form, but one of them might. Do you feel that what you're offering is almost like a step one, a step zero? How do you see it fitting in the man space, or the man space? Where do you see it on that spectrum?
Yeah, good question, Lewis. Andy's Man Club and various other men's groups will, to varying degrees, tackle issues kind of head on. Suicide, relationships, various issues that men experience. My preference is, I'm probably at a lower end of that scale, in that it's the community that matters most to me. The fact that they've actually turned up and they've come together. We've gathered a bit of wood together. We've, like, sometimes, I'll share the sort of processes that go into making a fire, and we'll drink coffee together. Do you know what? I think that is a huge percentage of it just right there, all on its own, because it takes a tremendous amount of courage to see something advertised online, then get into the car on Saturday morning alone and go there and know that you're not going to know anybody else. We've become less social creatures. So I have huge gratitude and respect for any guy that turns up. And so I won't put it on him. I say, right, Dave, let's hear about your anxiety, and then we'll take it round the circle. Yeah, I never run it like that. I think if we get to a stage where people are opening up and being honest, then we've got it right, and people feel safe to do that. And time, and without fail, if somebody says, you know what, I don't mind telling you, I'm struggling with this at the moment, it's always the same. 2 or 3 other dudes will acknowledge that in a meaningful way. Just sometimes with a nod, or they say, yeah, I get it, man, dealing with the same thing, or thank you for sharing, or, I've got the same shit going on. And that person goes home thinking, you know, I'm not crazy. I'm not the only person who's struggling with this. I think that's huge for me. If we have that happen, then fantastic.
What's your thoughts on the male loneliness pandemic, as it's been referred to, I guess? What do you think is missing? What do you think men want? Or do you think it's more an internal thing for that man in themselves?
Yeah, well, without meaning to sound really dull and old, I grew up in a time where, I grew up in a little village in Northamptonshire in England. The village hall always seemed to be in use. There was a village sports day. There were fetes. And on all of these occasions, The men of the village came together to move benches or make bales into a circle or into stalls and sands. This is what I remember happening. A community of men, guys who seem very different to a lot of the men I meet nowadays. But they had stuff in common. They were, obviously my father and a lot of the other men in the village went to church. Then there were sort of evenings where they did their own thing. They went to the pub or whatever. They had community. I don't know if, in my advancing years, if I'm becoming wistful and imaginative about this. Maybe it wasn't like that. And who knows what happened behind, closed doors in those other men's lives. Maybe it wasn't quite as rosy. I mean, it sounds like I'm describing the 1950s for one thing, but I do think that reasons for guys to come together in a non-alcoholic sense are fewer and fewer. I get a strong sense of that now. And I do think that cannot be helping the loneliness crisis at all. The other thing, of course, that I think will not be helping it is, guys' natural proclivity for saying, yeah, I'm absolutely fine. Or that I don't have time for that. I'm already, I'm paying a mortgage. I'm, paying for the kids' sort of school uniforms and stuff, and all of this other stuff going on. That is me at capacity, right now. And yeah, it's tough. I mean, within my own lifetime, it was possible for someone to live in London, pay a mortgage, raise a family, and have a wife who didn't need to work. Now it's practically impossible if you're a couple with no kids and you're both working. There are some much more significant demands on time and pressure, regarding finances, I think, and I can't imagine that's helping either.
For sure. I think there's a lot of additional pressures. One thing I think as well is the shift in society. It's more online. There is less community. There is less activity. And I think that just builds and adds to social anxiety. And I think the other thing that I always allude to is, and I think men have been guilty of this for quite a while, is having friends that are just their partners. It's not really their friends. They've just sort of created, they've got friends, but they're not. They're just blokes who date the women that they know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's a pretty grisly picture, isn't it? Having like real, genuine, solid friends, companions, stuff you can share sort of stuff with. Yeah, that does seem to be rarer. I mean, when my boys were little, I knew a lot of other guys because they were the sort of parents of all their little mates who came to the house. But that was the only reason that I knew them, and it was really only the only time we talked, picking them up from parties or from clubs or whatever. Yeah, you wouldn't really mistake that for any kind of community. It certainly didn't feel that way. And here's something from my own experiences, that when my wife and I split up and I moved 6 miles down the road to where I am now, not one of those dudes picked up the phone and said, "Are you okay?" Not that I was like, angry that they didn't, but it just kind of brought it home to me. Yeah, they weren't those sort of friends, really. Yeah, I actually ran into one of them in the shop last year. And he goes, "Oh, how have you been? How's single life?" I was like, "Mate, that was like 7 years ago." I was really tempted to add, "Do you know what? I wouldn't have minded you asking back then. I'd have had a different answer for you." And I was more annoyed that he thought that 7 years later I might still be single. But anyway, another story.
Yeah, that's there's almost a slight dig there, Tom. He's had you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But no, it's so true, and I think that's a common story amongst a lot of men, is that those relationships end, they break down. They may even reach out. Dave may go, "Right, I'm going to ring John," and John goes, "I can't talk to you because Sandra has said that we're on her side." Do you know what I mean? Like it is very
right.
As simple
it's very political.
Yeah. So it's a story not as old as time, but it is a common story these days for sure. One thing that I find really interesting with you, Tom, is that you have quite an open view and quite a cynical view on things. So you're quite clearly open with your like emotions and like to think about them and talk about them and create places that facilitate you to open up if you feel in a position to open up. Yet you still hold traditional values and also sort of that manly, rugged side of things, like building a fire, cooking outside. How did you find that balance?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, Lewis, and thank you for that. I think it came out of what I've just been describing, really, which was the end of my marriage. The boys were 9 and 11 at the time. I moved in here, and I told the lads that we were going to make this into the coolest house in the street, but I wasn't getting as much time with them as I would have liked. I was in a pretty bad place. I closed myself off to everybody because I just didn't want to answer questions about it, or how much time you're getting with the kids, or, just sort of practical stuff that I really didn't want to engage with. So I tried to do a lot of the work on myself because I knew I was in a bad place. Definitely a real low point. I went back to nature to, help me kind of reset. I discovered situational awareness, which is an aviation-based idea, but it can be repurposed for seeing your own dark moods coming, because that was the hardest bit, was these just sort of really bottomless pits of just gloom. And on reflection, I should have been speaking to other people. You can't just tough this out and grind through it and hope to be the same person at the end. I think I've improved my emotional coherence. I still don't like the word vulnerability. It just isn't never going to work. But being able to say, here's where I'm up to. I'm not actually doing brilliantly at the moment. And to be comfortable with being honest about that. Yeah, that is, I'm good with it now. Definitely. And it makes me wonder, actually, we persist with the sort of traditional man code of stoicism and contain it all because we don't have to look far back in our history to see thousands of phenomenally successful men who succeeded against all odds, carrying with them a tremendous amount of emotional baggage that they never once unpacked or kind of even acknowledged. So you can achieve, greatness while still being internally in an absolute turmoil. But imagine how much easier it would be if you weren't. I think this is why, one of the reasons so many guys stick to this traditional version, firstly, because it's unbelievably easy. All you've got to do is tell everyone you're fine, keep the lid on it, express your grief and unhappiness only in private. And, if you need to, you can still revert to rage as one of the sort of acceptable manly emotions. That's okay every now and again, or at least it's sort of understandable, apparently. And this setup works. It's a lot more difficult to be a little bit more emotionally coherent. And we don't have to look far back to see men who succeeded, greatly. And you won't find anything in their biographies, diaries, or letters about sort of self-doubt or grief or unhappiness. So we've had that example presented to us, throughout history. I think we can be honest, it does work. You can get there, you can achieve, you can be the guy you want to be and get the things you want. You've got to wonder if it wouldn't be a little bit easier if you had some sort of outlet, or you had people around you who you could say, do you know what, I am struggling today, I'm not in a great place, and just have them listen.
I've done a couple of podcasts, and
they can't fix everything for you.
Sorry, Tom. I've done a couple of podcasts where we've spoken around the marketing to men, and that vulnerability is a big one. And I think that sort of links back a little bit to ancestral times as well, where it's like being vulnerable to another man is dangerous. Like it puts you in danger. Only from a ancestral point of view. Right now, it doesn't. It's a lot easier to open up, and there's a lot less judgment, and there's also a lot less at stake for doing that, right? Like you can lose someone as a friend if you open up to them and it doesn't go the way you want to. But if that was your tribe and they were helping you stay alive, then that's obviously a lot more extreme. But there's still that sort of deep rooted. So that change in terminology and that change in attitude towards it as well, I think is really important. I don't like the word either. Why would anyone want to be vulnerable in any stage of their life? What's the actual benefit of that? It's a I'm choosing my words carefully, because weakness is, again, it's sort of trying to build up that stoicism. But why would you want to be weak at any point? You can still go through emotions in a, like you say, a coherent way. So it's interesting the way that you phrase it, and maybe it's a little bit of the old school in you, not wanting to buy into the new terminology, or maybe it is just you are the marketing genius that the man space needs.
It's probably maybe because I'm a work in progress, Lewis, but like a lot of men, most men who were lucky enough to have a father that was present, I drew a tremendous amount of my sort of example. Well, he gave me, the example that that I'm still running to an extent. My dad and I and my younger brother, we had some crazy adventures. We'd do some really, really dangerous things. Abseiled the quarry on some ropes that he'd found in the dump. I mean, they could have, but this was like great fun kind of stuff. We once took our rubber dinghy out to sea to visit, and it was an old concrete gun emplacement off the south coast where we used to go on holiday. And we rowed out to it, we examined it, and on the way back, my dad, not being by any stretch a nautical man, didn't realize that the tide had turned, and he had to row back against it while we all sang 15 Men on a Dead Man's Chest at the top of our lungs. And years later, he confessed, because I said, "Oh, do you remember that time we did that, Dad?" And he goes, "Yeah, that was one of the scariest experiences of my life. I thought we were going to be swept out to sea. I had zip energy left when we got back to the beach." I do remember him seeming kind of tired. Very strong man, my father, physically. He brought us back, but he didn't show a flicker. It was his idea to sing 15 Men on a Dead Man's Chest, because he knew that if he said, "Fellas, I'm absolutely terrified, I think we're screwed. We're going to be swept out to sea. No one's got a mobile phone or anything like that. This could be the end of us." Not a bit of it. He knew that. I mean, we were 5 and 4, my brother and I. We'd have been terrified if we'd have known what was in his head. So he's just stayed strong outwardly. "We're fine. Let's sing. We'll be back on the beach in no time at all." It's hard to unlearn stuff like that, because I know what would have happened if he'd have said, "Guys, we're doomed." It would have been terrifying. And he was always that guy. And I don't think, in later life, it served him well. He's never acquired a level of emotional coherence. I know what he's thinking. I still love him. He's a great dad, but he's from a generation that simply didn't do that.
Yeah.
Not at any price. Even facing death, as we were going to go down singing. It's a hard thing to unlearn, and it's a hard thing not to see tremendous value in. When people are relying on you, or they're going to be much more afraid if you decide to become vulnerable in that moment, then they're going to be scared too. Sometimes it's you do have to put a bit of a mask on to bring people through it. I was in a dark place when I first moved in here, but I made certain that when the boys came round, it was we were gonna have fun. We were gonna make the best out of it, even to the point where we had these toxic jokes around. They'd say, "Well, what do you do when we're not here?" And I said, "Well, I just lie on the couch in my pants eating frozen pizza and crying. Hey, that's what I do." It's actually closer to the truth than they do. But we developed this whole sort of ridiculous storyline about Dad's miserable, sad life on his own. But putting that spin on it was actually much, much easier than saying, "Do you know what? Yeah, it's been really, really tough." They were just little kids at the time. I was never going to put that on them. Yeah. No choice. Sorry, another long ramble there, but yeah, I drew a huge amount of example from my father, who was always able to maintain outward strength and calm, particularly when things got bad. Different story if anyone recorded over one of his videos, then you'd really see him lose it. But in a genuine crisis, he was absolutely rock solid every single time. I loved him for it.
I think that definition of emotional coherence really ties into that really well, because vulnerability just means that you're willing to just open up whenever you want to anyone, which as we've just alluded to, can be dangerous. And I think the way that you've articulated that is great. And I think a lot of men should take some use from that, because I think it's a simple yet effective way. One thing that you mentioned is that your dad was relatively fit, and so are you. But I believe that you're not a big fan of the gym. And I imagine that there are some men in their 50s listening that might go, well, I do want to sort of try and stay in some shape and get into some shape, but I'm shit scared of going to the gym. Like, what would you suggest to them? What's your some physical exercise?
Yeah, another great question, Lewis. I would firstly encourage those guys to think about what are they actually hoping to get from from the gym, or more specifically, what do they want to be able to do? I mean, I am in my 50s. I don't have to look pretty anymore, so I'm not really aiming for 9% body fat and to be able to squeeze into a little pair of budgie smugglers on the beach, because I never go to the beach. So my priorities are kind of, it's easier for me to clear up for myself what I want to be able to do. I do love the outdoors. I do love running sessions out there. That involves lifting and carrying heavy things, sometimes a reasonable distance. So I train for that. There's no shortage around here of heavy rocks, logs, and awkward things to carry on a slope. I don't have to get dressed up in some super tight little shorts and 300-pound trainers to do it either. I can wear jeans and boots for that. I use steel clubs and heavy hammers. Ancient warriors trained with these same tools, and they're pretty easy to find. And it takes a little bit of practice to use them well, but you'll develop grip strength and shoulder mobility and core strength. These are three absolutely vital things for later in life. I mean, you can have a body like a bunch of grapes and sort of, grapefruit biceps, but if you can't get the top off a tight jam jar lid, well, you're not really strong. And most conventional give you that. So yeah, I do some sort of, well, they would say they're untraditional or unconventional, but they're actually really ancient and very traditional ways of training. Get yourself a sledgehammer and learn to swing it, hit an old tire with it, or a tree stump or a log. Yeah, you're going to feel it, definitely, but your core and your grip strength, your mobility will improve. You won't end up looking like a fitness influencer. Sorry for anyone watching who thinks that's how it will happen. It won't. But the next time you are asked to perform a feat of strength to help somebody out, or in an emergency, you're going to have something very, very useful at your disposal. If you had to pick up an injured person from the ground and get them into a vehicle, no amount of bicep curls or abs crunches are going to do that for you. You've actually got to train lifting things that are heavy and awkward and have a poor center of gravity. So yeah, that's how I do it. I get some funny looks when I'm working out up at the park with a sledgehammer or my metal clubs, or hitting a tire with a baseball bat. Strangely, nobody ever comes up to ask what I'm doing. And if they did, you know what, I'd be really happy to share, no problem at all. But yeah, I find that a lot more useful than the gym. And I spent a lot of years in the gym, but I don't look back on it as something I got a great deal from. But, when you're 25, perhaps it's important to look good in a tight T-shirt. Of course it is. No, I get that. I totally get that. For guys, on or around my own age, yeah, there are some much more valuable alternatives that will make you strong in a functional way so that you can deliver on the day somebody says, Christ almighty, can you help them? I can't lift this. You can be that guy. Yeah.
Well, we'll put that to the test this weekend, because I'm having to move some radiators that I've been told are heavy, but I've not. I'm a gym guy, so we'll see how I get on with said radiators up and down some stairs. But yeah, you're right. Some functional fitness is really important. I mean, some of the stuff for me is like, you see a lot of bodybuilders and stuff like that, or people that go to the gym, they can't run a mile. Like that is also not a level of fitness. You can have as much muscle as you want, but if you can't physically be mobile, then you're also pretty useless. So there's different things to that.
Absolutely. I would encourage any of your viewers who are thinking about this to take a look at, there's some great pictures of Captain Scott's men that went to the Polar Party. the North Pole, his polar party that went to the North Pole, none of those boys would have made the cover of Men's Health in a million years. They were not conventionally attractive. They didn't have that modern sort of sculpted physique that we're presented with as this being the answer. And yet they pulled off one of the most unbelievable feats of human endurance. I mean, no one will ever do that again, because obviously mistakes were made and those men lost their lives, but they hauled a heavy sledge for hundreds of miles over, you know, uneven frozen ice in conditions that would have killed most people, but they weren't pretty. You know what? They didn't look like a fitness influencer. They were just extremely strong, powerful guys with great endurance. Who would you rather be when push comes to shove? And yet, you know, social media presents us constantly with these bulgy-eyed guys who look like boiled lobsters who are going to say, you're doing everything wrong. Why? Because they don't look like you? God damn. You know, what can you actually do? Let's see you do something that isn't in the gym. You're good at pushing weights. Yeah, gym will make you good at pushing weights.
Great. I like that. It's hopefully some people take some advice from it. Tom, in your opinion, what in the men's space right now is really good, and what do you want to see more of?
Yeah, I think it is an exciting time. It's never been a more complicated time to be a man, but I do feel, and I'm sure you feel the same, Lewis, it's why we're here, a bit of a sea change going on. There's a recognition that I think, you know, that we can do better. We can definitely do better. I'm seeing a very much more pleasing emphasis on men being there for their brother man, which I think is absolutely central for me in terms of core values. Yeah, there is a lot of talk about sort of vulnerability, etc., but there's also, you know, a lot of very positive talk about, you know, just it's okay to speak up about it, you know. And I see this sort of, you know, movement in the workplace. We might even be looking at very soon, well, they already exist, men's employee resource groups in the workplace, you know, as there are for every other protected characteristic group. And I think this is like really vitally important, you know, because, you know, in the workplace, at the end of the day, it's about the bottom line. It's we're going to do that better in your workplace for that to happen. Yeah, a bit of community, they benefit from that, you know, facility doing things. So I see this as very positive, very exciting actually, right now. And when we both spoke, Jindy Man, and for your viewers who aren't following him on LinkedIn, you should definitely check out what he's got to say. He said there's 4 billion ways to be a man. Damn straight there is. Yeah. Not that that's made things any easier, of course, but I think that's that kind of, yeah, underlines it for me a little bit.
Amazing, Tom. If people have liked what they've heard and they want to find out more, where is the best place to find you?
Well, I didn't used to like it so much, but I'm finding LinkedIn to be a really, really useful way to connect with other people working in this space and other sort of interesting people just generally. I certainly don't do hard sell. If anyone's got any questions for me, they can just fire me a question. I'll do my very flat out best to answer it. That's how I work. And I love connecting people with other people. You know, it's not always about what you can get from it. If you can put someone in touch with someone who you think they might actually make a good team or be able to collaborate together or help one another, absolutely, I'm all about that too. But yeah, LinkedIn, good place to find me right now.